Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Scrutiny Corner. I am your host, Lisa Hanley, and today we're going to speak with Professor Anand Menon about the current coverage of COVID-19 and the impact COVID-19 has had on working class people. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for coming on today.
That's all right, no worries.
How are you feeling? How are you?
All right, a bit stressed at the moment. We've got a load on, but all right.
Yeah, I can imagine. I definitely want to ask you about COVID-19 and the current coverage and the impact of working class people. But I do want to ask firstly, about the current social climate that we are in now, with the impact of the protests. Where is politics right now with these protests now? Like, do you think that politics has now changed?
Yes, there's something going on in politics now. Arguably, for the last 10 years, the division over values, as opposed to the sort of traditional left-right division, has become more important in our politics, and that was sort of turbocharged by the Brexit referendum. So I think this is partly a reflection of that this is the sort of value struggle in our politics coming out into the open. Whether or not, things are so unpredictable at the moment that it's perfectly credible, I think, to argue that, at the moment, in the context of a pandemic, in the context of Brexit going on, values are going to be front and centre, and that's what these protests and the reaction to the protests show. But, in 2 or 3 months' time, it might well be that the economic fallout of the pandemic is so all-consuming. If you look at the figures today about how much the furlough scheme is costing, how many jobs are dependent on the government paying salaries, when that furlough scheme starts being rolled back and we see, which sadly I expect to see, very high levels of unemployment going forward, it might be that the political debate in a sense shifts back to where it traditionally was, which is that argument about the economy, the role of the state, privatization versus nationalization, inequality, and so on. Now, there are elements to that debate about inequality in the debate about Black Lives Matters, obviously, because part of that debate is about structural inequality due to race. But I wouldn't be so bold as to say this is a turning point and everything will be different after this, because I just don't think we can be sure.
What do you think about these structural inequalities and the impact of these occupations also being a contributive factor to the COVID deaths? Like, some of these people are most likely to work in services like transport, cleaners, some of them working as carers, etc. Do you think that's a contributing factor, and do you think it's something as well to do with the inequality?
Well, absolutely, it's a contributing factor. There's no reason why these groups should be disproportionately in any profession. What you'd aspire to is a society where whatever colour you are, wherever you come from, your chances of becoming a judge are the same as for any other group in society. So there's something wrong when that isn't the case, though it would be naive to suggest that that's something that is easily fixed. I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic is it's caused us to have a debate about precarious work, the real value of low-skilled work, as we like to call it, though it often isn't low-skilled at all, it's just low-paid. What I'm still not convinced about is, after this very sort of, virtuous debate that we're all having with everyone saying this can't go on like this has to change, whether or not that can be put into real political action going forward is the big question. And I'm not convinced as yet that it will be. For a variety of reasons. It might be that some people don't agree, even though they're sort of voicing support for the idea of cutting inequality, and that actually the idea of large-scale distribution or tax rises for the most well-off won't get support in Parliament. But also, just remember, the sheer scale of the task that is going to confront government for the next 3, 4, 5 years of rebuilding from this pandemic is perfectly likely to blot everything else out. This is just a question of government bandwidth. So yes, it's good we're having a debate. It's a debate in a way that started with Brexit, because Brexit first made a load of people realise, oh wow, there are people who are unhappy. Never realised that. This has been sort of reinforced by by COVID, because both in terms of health outcomes, that's to say that BAME and less well-off people are disproportionately likely to die of this thing, but also in terms of the economic impacts, certain groups are more exposed than others. And of course, the absolute stinker is it's always the same bloody groups, isn't it?
Yeah. It's
So it's
crazy.
just misery piled on misery.
Do you think systematic racism does exist now in the modern day Britain?
Yeah, I mean, there are structural causes of inequality that manifest themselves in terms of racial disparities. But yeah, it goes beyond race. It's not purely race, but the fact of the matter is, if you're born into a less well-off family in a less well-off part of the country, your life chances are going to look less appealing than those born into wealthy families in wealthy parts of the country. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is a disgrace, whether you're poor and black or poor and brown or poor and white. The fact is, though, on top of that, is you are disproportionately likely to be in one of those disadvantaged households if you're black, which is another layer to the whole thing.
For it to be reported that these groups were disproportionately affected, and yet, you were constantly seeing you're most likely to die, if you are from these groups, and yet there was no cause of action, or how are we going to protect these groups? I think that was a bit, it was a huge injustice from my side to watch that the media say that, but not constantly push politicians to be like, we need a call of action for these people.
Yeah, but that being said, I suppose, just to play devil's advocate, it's all very well having a cause of action, but you can't suddenly replace loads of bus drivers in mid-pandemic by, there's a real time constraint going on here. I mean, I'd like to think, heaven forbid, were this to happen again, we would have learnt the lessons and acted on them, though our history is replete of episodes where we could and should have learnt lessons and haven't. So I think this is something we should be acting on. If you ask me whether I'm confident we will, no, not entirely.
Oh, that's not good. I was hoping for optimism and, this may change.
Well, it may change. I mean, I think it is better that we're talking about these things than that we're not. And it is more likely to change because we're talking about it than because we're not. There's an interesting conversation to be had about whether the statue protests and the sort of values polarization that is bringing about, or that is heightening, will help in that cause or not. Because the danger, of course, then is that people who are seen to be fighting for the legitimate aspirations of people not to face systematic inequality is mixed up with what the right are going to portray as violent Marxist thugs. Whether that delegitimizes the cause or not is an open question. I would rather personally, in a way, be talking about the present than about history, because what I would like us to be doing is dealing with the injustices of that inequality now. And it strikes me that unless Cecil Rhodes is an entree into that debate, then it's a distraction from what the real issue is.
Even in terms of the arrests during the pandemic, about 12% of London's population are from black minority backgrounds, and up to 31% of them were arrested during lockdown, which is disproportionate. And then on top of that, they were the largest group to be fined as well. So it's quite interesting, especially when you kind of put into context someone like Dominic Cummings. He broke the rules, and there is a different guideline for him per se than there is for everybody else.
It's hard to know what people are getting fined or arrested for. I mean, again, I would trace this back to the fact that maybe it is the case that Afro-Caribbean populations are more likely to live in places where there's no outdoor space at home, so you don't have gardens or things like that, which pushes you to go outside, which makes it more likely that you're going to be stopped, searched, questioned by the police, and whatever else it might be. I mean, I'm not for a moment, I've been stopped and searched. It's not pleasant, it's humiliating, and you know why it's happening. So I'm not saying that this is right, but again, I think there are causes behind this. I think the damaging thing about the Dominic Cummings affair was this perception that there is one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. I don't think that is a place where government wants to be when it is trying to offer advice that it needs the public to take and needs to be taken on trust.
Yeah, it's almost like we're in a do what I say, not what I do type government, and it's very scary to be in that kind of space, because you're kind of building like a distrust and a separatism between people and the government. Do you think that we currently live in a democracy right now, or are we Is there an
We live in a
imbalance?
democracy, yeah. It's a flawed democracy, like all other democracies. I think it was Churchill who said it's the best system of, it's a bad system of government except when compared to all the other possible ones. I mean, it's hard to get democracy right, and there are all sorts of ways you can pick holes in our democracy, whether it's the electoral system and the way it gives disproportionate influence to a small number of people in marginal constituencies, whether it's the lack of real local and regional government, which means that everything seems to be done via the lens of London. One of the interesting things is, politicians are obsessed with high-speed trains, whereas the majority of the population never take high-speed trains. They take buses, or they might drive to work or whatever. I mean, there are ways in which the excessive centralization of this country means it would be good for people to have local voices who can take decisions about them, being more familiar with local conditions. So yeah, I'm not for a moment going to say British democracy is perfect. I don't think any democracy is perfect. There are all sorts of ways I would reform it. And let's not kid ourselves. I mean, why is it visible now? For a whole variety of reasons. One, because of what's happened in the United States and this global wave of protest. Two, because we're still emerging from, the best part of 10 years of austerity. And so, wages are flatlined, inequality isn't looking great, all those sorts of things. There are reasons why there is particular dissatisfaction at this time. But in a way, it has always been like that, which is not to say that it's right, but it's worth saying this isn't a new phenomenon. And what we need is to aspire to a society where your wealth doesn't buy you privileges, particularly when it comes to the law.
I think it's even more magnified now, especially during lockdown, where all we are doing as, members of the masses are just kind of waiting for the government to open up the places that we're used to going to, schools, our work, our jobs, I find that, these disparities have shown with people that during the lockdown couldn't not go to work. They have been working throughout the whole time and had to suffer not having the PPE, not being shielded, and have died as a consequence. And
absolutely,
it's absolutely unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's particularly acute in the case of care homes, but remember, this is, one of the things about this is it does go beyond class, because a lot of what you said applies to doctors too, who by no measure are badly off or, suffering from inequality. So, there are issues about this. I mean, I come from a family of people who work in the NHS, and it strikes me as weird that we've only just realised that sort of work is dangerous. I mean, hospitals have been breeding grounds for MRSA for many, many years. You always faced a risk of infection, if you spent your working life in a hospital. I mean, it's nice that we've realised. It strikes me as slightly belated, that's all. But what we do about it, I mean, firstly is, I think, to go back to my original point, is we need to acknowledge, and I think we're there now, that we're acknowledging it, but we need to go beyond the fact that, hey, everyone in Britain now seems to be against slavery. Well, I should bloody well hope so. But, but in a sense, that's not the issue.
Yeah. It isn't. It's because if we kind of keep going back to the past, we're not really addressing the present, and the things that happen in the present are like a kind of modern day take on what once was, but it's more of a subtle version. And I think we need to be able to let other people see what that is, because it's hard to explain in itself, There
are layers to this, aren't there? I mean, it is, I think, good that people aren't as overtly racist as they used to be. I think I detect a northern accent.
I'm from Manchester.
All right, okay. I mean, I grew up in West Yorkshire in the 1970s, and West Yorkshire in the 1970s was an openly racist place where people would shout "Paki" across the street to you in the middle of the daytime on a Saturday in the main shopping strip.
Oh God! Wow.
Right? That doesn't happen anymore. That is a good thing.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't, it's a question of balance in all these things. One of the problems with political debate at the moment is it's so polarized. So it's either yes, it is, or no, it isn't. But the truth always lies somewhere in between. It is good that doesn't happen anymore. But that shouldn't mean that some of the fundamental problems stemming from years of discrimination have gone away, because they haven't, because as we've said, they're systemic. So people who've grown up in poverty, their life chances are worse. It might be that you can no longer put no blacks, no Irish, no dogs in the windows of hotels or B&Bs or whatever, but it is still the case, as we've seen, even amongst middle-class professions like doctors. We saw, I remember a few years ago, that someone did an experiment where they sent out an identical CV, except one had an Asian name, one had an English name, and the CV with the English name was offered more interviews than the other one, and the CVs were identical. So there is a lingering sense of discrimination, but layered on top of that, for people who are worse off, there is that structural inequality. And we shouldn't ever forget, I don't think, that those structural inequalities affect people of all race.
Yeah.
So it's not just about, and in a sense, I'm tempted to think that it is the white people who feel those pressures who are most easily drawn towards sort of far right-wing movements because of that sense that they're not doing well enough.
Yeah.
If you're poor and you feel that society is discriminating against, and you feel that your life chances are limited from birth through something that is utterly no fault of your own, chances are you're going to grow quite angry.
Do you think that's got anything to do with Brexit and the outcome?
No, not yet. I mean, yes, Brexit has had an impact on the British economy so far, but my God, this sort of inequality far predates Brexit. We've tolerated it for far, far too long. And we've tolerated it or thought about it in a narrow way, which is kind of, things like, working tax credits helped a load of families, but the thinking behind working tax credit was, let's make sure they've got enough cash for their food and maybe a quick flutter at the bookies and maybe, a couple of pints on a Friday night, and that will keep them happy. Whereas actually, there are far more profound issues here about your ambitions for your children, them being able to do better than you, about pride in the work you do, all those kinds of things, which matter fundamentally to people's quality of life and how people see themselves and value their own contribution to society. So we need to think in a far more rounded way about those sorts of issues.
Do you think that the coverage of COVID by journalists, do you think that journalists should have scrutinised the government more? I
think there's been plenty of criticism of the government from journalists. In fact, I remember that journalists early on getting abused for being too critical of the government at the time when the country should have been, in inverted commas, coming together. But I think, it is the job of journalists to scrutinise. It is the job of journalists to dig down behind what government is saying and see whether it's true or not. I think the way some political reporters have covered some of the stories around Dominic, the Guardian broke the Dominic Cummings scoop. So there was a lot of criticism of the government around that. My one sort of concern early on in the crisis was that because the daily briefings were attended by political journalists, we weren't getting enough good detailed questions on the science behind this. And I do wonder whether actually if science correspondents were the people at those press conferences in the early stages, the government might have faced far more probing questions about its response to the initial stages of the virus, which, as we're coming to learn, could have been better.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of written work about that, but there wasn't a lot of TV or broadcast coverage covered by science correspondents. So I think you're right there.
And I think they weren't at those press conferences. They weren't able to confront the politicians or the scientists who used to go to those things regularly and go less regularly now, with questions about the science itself.
Yeah. The way that this pandemic has been covered has been eye-opening for me, because how do you cover as a journalist being in a pandemic, maybe never covering a pandemic before, with a government that has never handled a pandemic before. And every single day, it's just like everyone is just learning on the job. And I kind of got that gist with Boris. The government trust has gone down 15% for this current government. Do you think that this has got a lot to do with the way that he, every day the guidelines were different? Sometimes he would say one thing and then he would mean another. PPE wasn't really covered. Lockdown was late. Do you think that he lost the public trust by the way that he covered this and way he handled it?
Firstly, I don't think anyone expects a prime minister to know the stuff. No one comes into the office of prime minister being an expert on coronavirus or whatever the next, Gordon Brown wasn't an expert on foot and mouth. But what you do expect is for the prime minister to have advice from the best people, to understand that advice, to follow it, and on the back of that advice to give clear guidance to the public. Now, it seems to me that particularly in the wake of the Cummings affair, when trust started to get eroded anyway, and it's hard to see that this wasn't partly an attempt to divert attention away from the Cummings affair, that the government introduced a whole series of things that were slightly ill thought out, like the initial stages of loosening lockdown. The rules weren't particularly clear. It was pretty hard to know what you were doing. Now, partly it is hard to do this. It is hard to to dictate the movements of a whole population without there being some ambiguity. I think there have been presentational problems. I think the way the government trumpeted the opening of zoos whilst at the same time saying schools wouldn't open was just a very, very bad look. For a government that is supposedly ultra sophisticated when it comes to reading the public mood, they have made a lot of mistakes in their handling of their messaging. I think, on the other hand, there are, you can flip that on its head and say in other areas, clearly it's only been about the messaging rather than the substance. I think this quarantine policy is a case in point. It strikes me that most of the experts seem to think it's far too late to be having a quarantine policy. If our rates are higher than those of the countries from which people are coming, it makes no sense. But it looks like the government thinks it's good politics, certainly amongst their voters, and so are going to continue with it. So yeah, I think, it would be a miracle for any government to come out of this without making mistakes. One of the striking differences between our government and most other Western governments is our government have been reluctant to admit even the possibility that they've made mistakes. I think that's the other element that has slightly jarred with people, is if you came out and said, look, this has been a pandemic. We've not experienced anything like this before. It's been incredibly difficult. I'm sure mistakes were made for which I would like to apologise, but we will learn from those mistakes. It might be that would go down better with the public than this stubborn insistence we took all the right decisions.
And that they followed the science.
Yeah.
On the
Which in itself is a silly phrase because there is no such thing as the science.
Yeah, I keep hearing the science, and I couldn't figure out why he kept saying it.
It's a bit like saying I followed the politics. Well, which politics? The scientists all came to slightly different conclusions. Scientists don't tend to agree. It's like saying I followed the economists. Well, in which case your economic policy would change hourly because economists have so many different opinions. So ultimately, and this is why being a politician is a thankless task. You are responsible for making the difficult choices. It's your job to get the evidence and say, on the basis of this evidence, I think that or that. And if you're wrong, to live with the consequences.
Yeah. On the 29th of May, the UK was voted the lowest in the way that they handled COVID, next to France. Do you think that the way this was handled will have any impact on Brexit?
I don't think the government would have acted any differently had we not been having a pandemic now. In fact, in a sense, there are some people arguing that the pandemic strengthens the case for getting out of the European Union at the end of the year.
How do you think it strengthens the idea to get out of Europe?
Well, there are people who are saying, look, we need to be free to regulate our own economy, to sign our own trade deals, to help our recovery post-COVID, and PS, even if Brexit means an economic impact, given the scale of the economic impact of COVID, it will be nicely hidden under that impact. And so actually, this is a good time to get the Brexit damage out of the way because people won't notice.
Do you think that a recession is likely?
Obviously, if you make the economy stop dead in its tracks, it's going to have a massive impact on growth. And the figures are absolutely eye-watering. The question is, and we don't know the answer to this, but the longer lockdown goes on, the harder it is to bounce back. We don't know. I mean, we don't know how many of the people who have been furloughed have a job to go back to. At the moment, if you're an employer, it's perfectly easy. Let the government pay their wages. But actually, at the same time, you might be going out of business. So when the furlough starts to lift, I think the first stage is in the tapering is the government will ask employers to pay 20%. We'll get a first sense then of how many people have lost their jobs. But I think there are job losses. There are companies that have gone to the wall. There is, we don't know what happens with consumer demand. They open the shops on Monday. Will loads of people turn up to the shops and go shopping because they haven't been allowed out? Or will everyone stay at home saying, actually, I don't feel safe? What will happen to pubs and restaurants? How many non-chain restaurants that you're used to going to will exist after this pandemic? We just don't know. So actually, the economy will become the crucial issue going forward, but we just don't know with any degree of certainty what kind of state it's going to be in when we start to come out of this.